Today on the Agamaga podcast, we're continuing our introduction series on A Course in Miracles. And in this episode, we're doing part one of a four-part mini-series on the core concepts of the Course. We want to discuss who we are and how we got here according to the teachings of A Course in Miracles using some visual aids. Discussing these ideas using diagrams will be helpful to understand something that's really very hard to understand with just words. So let's get started. My goal for today is to introduce you to some of the core course ideas in the shortest amount of time to get you familiar with the common terms and concepts it presents. Now, this isn't going to be a very comprehensive discussion because we could and we will do an episode on each of these ideas that we present today in more detail. But as we get started on our journey reading and discussing the text and doing the lessons together in these upcoming episodes, it will be helpful to have a general overview of what the Course is teaching about who and what we are, how we got here, and why we're here. I think I've mentioned this in the past, but the entire Course is close to 1,500 pages, and it's really the purpose of this podcast series is to evolve all of the ideas that the Course presents in great detail and to do this over time. But we really want to help you get started on the workbook lessons as soon as possible. And we want to do that by giving you the greatest amount of understanding to help support you as you begin. So, you may find it helpful to watch this video from time to time as we journey together, just to refresh your understanding of the Course while we're studying it. And over this four-part series, I'm going to show three different slide diagrams. In this episode, we're discussing a diagram titled ACIM Concepts, and that makes sense because that's what this little four-part series is about. So I'll show you the complete diagram first, and then I'll run through it progressively. And this will give you a linear idea of how these ideas interrelate and how they unfold. And this will lay out, what the Course defines as the problem and the solution that it provides. And in part two, we'll review a diagram called the kingdom. In part three, we'll review a diagram called the ego body. And then finally, in part four, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some reading directly from the Course that relates specifically to the concepts that we cover in these three previous parts. And in that way, you'll get a sense of how it will be to have me share the Course with you. So let's get started on that first diagram. Okay, so as I bring up this first diagram, it can seem very busy, but I want to show you the full diagram. This is where we'll end up. And I'm just going to run through it, fairly quickly, just because this will be the initial time that many of you have heard of these concepts or get a general understanding. But anyway, this is where we'll end up. So really, when we start out, we throughout time, the circle really has always represented all that there is in all of creation. It's really hard to understand eternity and infinity and those types of ideas. We can have, and we do have, occasion to have direct experiences with this, and it is very powerful and can be quite overwhelming to our small self. But for us, for our understanding, we can just think of that everything that exists really exists within this sphere. And really, what the Course is saying is that the only thing that truly exists, the only thing that is real is God. And it is really, God is not a being that is a separate thing. We could think of it as it is consciousness, and that's a tricky word, but we'll just use it. We're not going to be extremely precise today. All these terms can be, very loaded. But we could really think that all there is the mind of God. God is mind. Um, and and God is, yeah, so God is the domain of mind. God is the domain of spirit, is the domain of eternity and infinity. And the quality of God, or what God is really synonymous with love. Okay. And out of this love, God created what we call the Christ. Many times you'll hear the idea of Jesus the Christ, but what the Christ is the Christ is a consciousness. It is an aspect of the mind of God that God extended itself and created the Christ, and this is what the Course will call the sonship, or the Son of God. The Son, the Christ, the sonship are all one. And this is really just a thought in the mind of God. And it is what the Course would call our true self. And there's this idea of what is creation and what is true creation. The Course will be talking about the difference between creating something and making something. So creation is true, and it comes from the extension of itself. So God has given everything that it is, has extended itself fully. Everything that it is, the Christ is endowed with those qualities, those capabilities that what I would say is knowledge. Okay, so what the relationship between these aspects of mind, of God the mind, and the Christ, the thought of a thought in the mind of God, communicates through a process of direct revelation. Because God gave everything it is to the Christ has everything, and so it knows everything. So there are no questions, there's just knowing, and it comes through this aspect of direct revelation. And then was the beginning of this problem that occurred, where there was this idea of separation within the Christ mind. Within the mind of the Christ was this idea of separation, which is impossible. But instead of rejecting the idea of being separate, somehow being outside of God, which is impossible because everything is contained within God, in order for this to be true, there would have to be a splitting of mind. Reality and illusion would have to split off from each other. And so what we see is this further splitting of mind. And here I have it represented as these kind of funny puzzle pieces, but you could think that everything that exists and believes itself as a separate thing, there's a process in place, and that was the formation of the ego. So in order to have the idea and hold the idea of separation, there had to be a splitting of mind, and then there had to be some kind of a function to keep that idea in place, and that is what the Course talks about, the ego. Okay. And within this idea of separation, this is what we experience as the small self. And the Course sometimes talks about it as miscreation. We're using our mind incorrectly. We are creating ideas or making ideas of separation, separate selves, separate things that do not share in this experience of direct revelation, right? And so it is. I'm jumping ahead here. I wanted to use a different word here, but I'm going to hold on. So what we're doing is we're in this process of image making, where everything that we seem to see or perceive, that's where I wanted to get to sense perception. So within this miscreation, in order to do this, we have to perceive things. We perceive things as somehow separate from us, somehow outside of us. And, this is this process of image making, and this is the experience of what the Course talks about, that we have created this illusion of body, this illusion of the physical world, the illusion of time and space, where there is a beginning and an end, and we come into body and we leave body, and there's this idea of birth and death and reincarnation. So all of that is happening within this split mind. It is the idea of separation, and we are basically experiencing a thought system of the ego. Okay. And because we believe ourselves as separate, because we experience here life and death, this can generate tremendous fear, because essentially we feel like we're alone. We're separate from each other. We're separate from God. And that can be a very fearful place. And not only that, but there's also this psychological condition where there's this arising of shame and guilt. Shame and guilt from having left eternity, from having left God. And we somehow feel that we would be punished if we were to return from God. And so we do everything, or the ego does everything it can to basically to try to protect us in one way, protect us from having to go back and face this illusion of wrath, right, of punishment for having left God. And in reality, we could never leave God, right? There's just this idea of leaving God, yet we are still whole in the Christ. The Christ is complete, even though within it we can imagine, and you can think of this as when you have a daydream. You know, you are here having this experience, and then somehow you kind of lose consciousness and you get caught up into a daydream, and you're really into that daydream. And then you come back to reality, or to this experience of reality, and you're like, wow, okay, well, that was just a daydream. But in your mind, it seemed very, very real. And we can do this through visualization. We have experiences of this in the sleeping dream state. So we can see that it is possible for us to have ideas, imaginings of another reality. Okay. And so then within this idea of separation, where we have shame and guilt and fear, we end up taking all of that unconscious shame and guilt and we project it onto other aspects, other ideas of separated selves, you know. And this is a classic psychological condition where we're always projecting our ideas or our beliefs, our story of reality onto others, making up stories about others. So the Course will say that actually when this separation happened, multiple egos were created. There was the ego that is created that gives us the sense of a separated self, and then when we're in the separated self, when we look out on others, we also create an ego for every other aspect of creation that we perceive to be there. And so we're projecting this idea of what that is. Okay. So all of that process happened. Okay, now there's a few things that we need to talk about, because you're going to see the Trinity here. It's God, the Father, the Son, and now all of a sudden I brought up this this image of the Holy Spirit. And really, the Holy Spirit, in terms of the Course, you could think of it as really as nothing other than our right mind. Okay, so at the moment, because there was this process of direct knowledge and direct revelation between God and the Christ, when this idea of separation occurred, what God noticed was that there was a breakdown in communication. Okay? There was an aspect of the mind, not all of the Christ, not all of the Christ, but there was an aspect of the Christ mind that there was not direct knowledge. The direct revelation was blocked somehow. And in that moment, that was the beginning of the problem, and the solution was given, which was God infused the Holy Spirit, which is our right mind, as a property or principle that united God the Father, the Christ, and this aspect of mind. And you could think of it as, I keep trying to bring back, to psychological principles. And this idea of almost like multi-personality disorder, right? Where you have this fractured self, and you have all these different identities. And what is the solution of that? The solution of that is to reconnect those broken and split aspects of self to the true self. Okay. And so that is the purpose and the function of the Holy Spirit. Okay. Okay. So it is nothing more than our right mind. It's actually available to us right now. And it keeps the entire process. And without the Holy Spirit, we could potentially persist in this idea of separation for eternity. Okay. And so then there's this other concept within the Course, which we'll talk about in probably a whole episode. It'll continue coming up, but it's called the atonement. And the atonement, what you can think of it is at one-ment. So there is a process of bringing back to one. So it is when all the believed or ideas of separated selves are brought back into one. It is the atonement. So it's not like, a pain, a penance, or a punishment, or like atoning for one's sin. So in the Course in Miracles, it's not on the diagram, but the idea of sin is really a mistaken idea. It's the idea that we could be a separated self, but there is no such thing as mortal sin. It is just a mistaken idea. In archery, there's this idea of sin where it really just means you've missed the mark. So when you create a sin in archery, you just haven't hit the bullseye. Okay? So the atonement is a process, and the atonement is a principle within the Course in Miracles. Okay. So now we get to Jesus the Christ, So this is probably a really challenging thing could be a challenging thing for other Christians. But really Jesus, according to the Course, so Jesus is the author of A Course in Miracles. And Jesus gave this teaching because Jesus once was one of the separated ones. He had this belief that he was a separated self, right? And through his process, he had awakened to his right mind, to the Christ consciousness. So that's why he was Jesus the Christ. And so he had, through the Holy Spirit, had reached this atonement process. And he did it through a process, what the Course is really, the cornerstone of the Course process. Like, what is the solution? It is forgiveness. And now the forgiveness that we talk about in the Course is going to be different from what we're traditionally think of as forgiveness, or how we're used to thinking of forgiveness. So in the Course's teaching, really what it's saying is that, we get to a place where we realize that nothing that we're experiencing here is real. Okay. So at a fundamental level, that means we could never be harmed. We could never be hurt, because our true self is eternal. We are the Christ. And yet we imagine that we are separate, and we go through this process of shame and guilt and fear and projection, and we're just caught in these stories. And so the forgiveness process was the realization where Jesus got to the realization where he wasn't a body. He was eternal spirit. He was eternal. He was the Christ, just as you and I are the Christ. And so the Course teaches about this forgiveness process, which is waking up, forgiving the illusion, and waking up to reality. And in that process, we go through this atonement process. And that brings us back to our right mind. So in a nutshell, those are the core concepts of the Course. And that's what this diagram tries to point out. Now, there are many, many other things that the Course talks about, different aspects of each one of these things, different ways of working. How do we get through? How do we actually do that forgiveness process? And the workbook lessons, of course, are the mind training process that takes us from that thought system of the ego to the thought system of the Holy Spirit, from the thought system of this idea of separation and the cause of all the problems we are experiencing in this separated state, in this belief of our separated state, to the thought system of the Holy Spirit, which is our right mind. The thought system of the Holy Spirit that brings us back to our experience, not just our understanding, but direct knowledge and direct revelation of our oneness with each other as the Christ, as the sonship, the Son of God. So thank you so much for following along with part one of our presentation today on discussing the core concepts of the Course in Miracles. We really look forward to having you join us for parts 2, 3, and 4. We hope this episode gives you inspiration to continue your reawakening journey. Please like this podcast so it can reach others, and leave us a comment or question. And until next time, may you continue to be blessed by life, and may you experience the peace, joy, and love which sustains you. Remember, you're exactly where you need to be. The teacher is within you. Your life is your path, and teach only love, for that is what you are.